When the residents of Raven Hollow, a quiet mountain town tucked beneath a canopy of whispering pines, woke to find a teenage girl standing barefoot in the middle of Main Street, her face streaked with blood and her memory blank, no one could have guessed what was coming. She whispered only 4 words before collapsing. "He's still down there." By nightfall, the sheriff's department had discovered a farmhouse basement that shouldn't have existed, a hidden chamber lined with hundreds of photographs, each one capturing a different missing person, each taken by the same trembling hand. But this story isn't about a serial killer. It's about the man who swore he wasn't one. A local therapist whose calm voice had soothed half the town's grief, and who may have used that trust to feed an obsession too dark to name. In Raven Hollow, everyone has secrets, some buried in the woods and some sitting right beside you in church. If stories like this pull you in, the quiet towns, the hidden rooms, the people who look normal until they're not, then hit that subscribe button. It's the easiest way to stay close to the mysteries we uncover each week. And if you think you'd have spotted the truth in Raven Hollow, drop your theory in the comments. Let's see who really notices the cracks before they split wide open. The rain had ended hours ago, but the streets of Raven Hollow still glistened, as if the sky couldn't quite let go of its sorrow. It was 4:12 a.m. when Deputy Clara Finch rolled past the abandoned gas station at the north edge of town, her patrol headlights carving tunnels of white through the fog. Raven Hollow wasn't the sort of place that made news. Its biggest headlines came from county fair ribbon winners and church renovations. But that morning, as the beam of her cruiser caught the faint shimmer of movement ahead, everything that sleepy town believed about safety, about normalcy, began to fracture. Standing in the middle of Main Street was a girl no older than 17, barefoot, shivering, her pale nightgown streaked with mud and something darker. For a long second, Clara thought she was a hallucination born of exhaustion. Then the girl blinked, and the way her pupils tried to focus through the patrol lights made her terrifyingly real. Clara stepped out, one hand on her radio, the other half raised in the universal gesture for calm, and said softly, "Hey, sweetheart, you okay?" The girl didn't answer. She stared past the deputy, her lips barely parting before whispering 4 words that would replay in Clara's mind for years. "He's still down there." The words landed with a chill that outlasted the night. By the time backup arrived, the girl had collapsed. Paramedics found no ID, no phone, only faint ligature marks around her wrists that suggested she'd been bound. There were no footprints leading to her, no tire tracks, nothing but the outline of her small frame on the wet asphalt where she had stood. The direction of her gaze pointed toward the tree line behind the old Miller property, a collapsed farmhouse locals called the Bones, because its timbers jutted from the earth like ribs. The sheriff's office decided to check the property after sunrise, though everyone in town knew no one had lived there for 20 years. Inside the ambulance, the girl's pulse spiked at the mention of it. She didn't open her eyes, just repeated that same broken sentence, quieter this time, as though speaking it too loudly might wake whatever she was trying to escape. "He's still down there." When dawn came, Raven Hollow looked almost peaceful, the kind of gray stillness that pretends nothing bad can happen in daylight. Sheriff Marcus Hale, a man with 30 years of small-town law behind him, drove out with 2 deputies to the farmhouse. The air around the property smelled of rain and rust. Boards covered the windows, ivy had strangled half the porch, and a condemned 1999 notice flapped against the door like a tattered warning no one had read. Hale expected raccoons or squatters at worst. What he found instead started with a draft of air that didn't belong. Behind a sheet of warped plywood in the hallway was a seam, a perfect vertical cut that looked accidental until the sheriff pressed it and felt it give way. The panel swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow stairwell sinking into darkness. A sour, metallic smell drifted up, bleach layered over something older. Hale called for a flashlight and descended. Each step groaned under his boots, the light wobbling over concrete walls lined with egg crate foam. This wasn't storage. It was insulation, soundproofing. The basement looked surgical in its precision. A metal chair was bolted to the floor. A video camera sat on a tripod aimed directly at it. Shelves carried labeled VHS tapes, hundreds of them, spines marked with numbers instead of names. The walls were papered with photographs, faces of men, women, children, each one neatly dated in red ink. Hale froze when he recognized two of them from statewide missing person bulletins, a college student from Kingston Falls, a retired teacher from Dover Creek. In the corner, a single folded page rested on the concrete. Written in an unsteady hand were 3 words: "Do not wake him." Hale radioed for evidence techs but kept staring at that line, wondering if him referred to the owner of the basement or something else entirely. Upstairs, the morning light slipped through cracks in the boards, touching the sheriff's boots as if hesitant to enter that room. He turned off his flashlight and said quietly, to no one in particular, "We've got a problem." By afternoon, the farmhouse was wrapped in yellow tape, and every news van in the county had parked along the gravel shoulder. The girl, identified through fingerprints as Mara Ellison, 17, missing 3 weeks from Kingston Falls, remained in a medically induced rest at St. Agnes Hospital. She'd been labeled a runaway in her hometown. Her case file barely filled a folder. Now it was evidence in something far larger. Sheriff Hale requested federal assistance within hours, and soon the quiet perimeter of Raven Hollow filled with agents and forensic tents. The tapes found in the basement were cataloged, their labels photographed. What they showed, once viewed, changed the entire direction of the case. None contained violence. Instead, each depicted a single subject seated in the metal chair, speaking softly to someone off camera. A man's voice guided them through questions about memory, fear, childhood trauma. The sessions were clinical, calm, eerily so, and every tape began with the same phrase spoken by the unseen interviewer: "Let's begin where the noise stops." Voice analysis confirmed what locals already feared. The speaker was Dr. Adrian Cole, Raven Hollow's only licensed trauma therapist. For years, he'd been the town's confidant, the man grieving widows called, the counselor schools relied on when tragedy struck. His clinic sat 3 blocks from the courthouse. Its sign painted a reassuring shade of blue. He'd published essays about cognitive recovery, hosted mindfulness nights at the library, even helped raise funds for the Veterans Center. If the voice on those tapes was his, then the town's most trusted listener had been orchestrating something unspeakable. Agents searched Cole's home that evening. His car was gone, his phone disabled, and his computer wiped clean except for one encrypted file titled Subject 26. Mara's locket was found inside his desk drawer. The next morning, she woke briefly and whispered to the attending nurse that she had been underground and that he talked through the walls. She remembered flashes of a metronome ticking, the hum of fluorescent lights, and a hand tapping 3 times on a table before every question. When asked if the man ever hurt her, she said, "He wanted to fix me." Then she turned her face to the wall and stopped responding. Trauma specialists called it dissociation. The sheriff called it programming. By the end of that week, Raven Hollow's foundation had splintered. Neighbors who once exchanged pies and small talk now eyed each other with suspicion. Parents pulled their children from Dr. Cole's former clients group, fearful that therapy notes might hide darker truths. The church organized nightly vigils, candles flickering against the October wind. Yet amid all the panic, one detail gnawed at Sheriff Hale. The note from the basement: "Do not wake him." Evidence teams had found no trace of a second person living there, no biological remains, no fingerprints other than Cole's. And still, the handwriting on that paper didn't match his. 3 nights later, at 2:47 a.m., dispatch received another 911 call from a stretch of road 11 miles north. A trucker's voice shook as he described a figure standing barefoot in the middle of the asphalt, facing the woods. When deputies arrived, the road was empty except for a single footprint in the mud and a smear of blood leading toward the pines. The print matched Mara Ellison's size exactly, but she was still under hospital observation, connected to machines that never stopped beeping. The timestamp of that 911 call aligned precisely with the moment one of those machines registered a spike in her heart rate, as though she'd seen something no one else could. In towns like Raven Hollow, legends grow fast, but fear grows faster. Within days, rumors twisted into folklore that the woods behind the Miller property were cursed, that Cole had awoken something buried long before he arrived, that the him mentioned in the note wasn't a man at all. Sheriff Hale didn't believe in curses. He believed in evidence. Yet when he returned to the farmhouse for a final sweep, he found the basement colder than before, the egg crate foam damp with condensation, as if the walls themselves were breathing. On the far wall, where photographs once hung in perfect rows, one was missing, the picture of Mara Ellison. The nail where it had been pinned still quivered, though no one had touched it. Hale switched off his flashlight and listened. The silence pressed back like a living thing. Somewhere in that dark, the faint echo of a metronome ticked 3 times, then stopped. The day after the tapes were first screened inside the evidence room at the Raven County Sheriff's Department, the atmosphere shifted from shock to something heavier, an unspoken understanding that they were no longer chasing a suspect, they were unraveling a philosophy. Sheriff Hale stood with his elbows on the metal table, eyes fixed on the frozen image of the basement chair flickering across the monitor. The tape, labeled Subject 17, played without sound now. The girl on screen, young, hair damp from tears or sweat, stared past the camera as if trying to look directly at the person behind it. Her lips moved, but the muted playback offered no words, only the rhythm of speech and pause, like a lullaby without melody. Beside Hale, Special Agent Dana Reeves from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit made notes in a tight, clinical hand. She'd flown in from Quantico that morning, her expression unreadable. "You've seen a lot of strange things," she said quietly. "But this is something different. He's not documenting trauma. He's orchestrating it." Hale nodded, jaw tight. "And he was doing it right under our noses." The tapes told 2 stories, the visible one of therapy sessions and the hidden one woven through inconsistencies that only a trained mind would spot. Each subject referenced sounds, humming walls, dripping water, a ticking rhythm that always began 3 seconds before they spoke. It was as if they were responding to a cue only they could perceive. Reeves, methodical and detached, replayed segments at quarter speed and logged every repetition. The phrase, "Let's begin where the noise stops," occurred at the start of every session. But in tape subject 9, Cole added a variation. "Let's begin where you stopped being afraid." The camera angle shifted slightly in that recording, catching the faintest glimpse of a hand tapping 3 times against a table, a conditioned signal, perhaps, to prompt a response. "He's experimenting with associative recall," Reeves said. "Inducing fear, then guiding them through exposure therapy without consent. It's Pavlov meets Jung." Hale exhaled through his teeth. "So we're not dealing with insanity. We're dealing with method." In Cole's office, the investigation unit found binders labeled Patient Notes, Cognitive Regression Series. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Each entry began clinically, age, presenting symptoms, progress notes, but ended with detached philosophical musings. Fear must be harvested at its origin. Another read, "The voice can reshape memory if timed with the body's tremor." One paragraph chilled even Reeves. "To cure the human soul, one must first isolate the fracture. Not mend it, observe it." There was no empathy in the words, only the cool fascination of a man dissecting human pain as though it were a specimen. As Hale read those entries aloud, something about the precision reminded him of old case studies he'd read from the 1970s. Psychological conditioning experiments later banned for their cruelty. Cole had studied at the University of Vermont under a professor known for his research into trauma recall. When Reeves pulled the professor's file, she found a published paper co-authored by Adrian Cole titled The Persistence of Emotional Echoes in the Subconscious Mind. The final paragraph theorized that, under the right conditions, reintroducing trauma stimuli could reboot the mind's self-protective architecture. Reeves looked up from the page. He's not torturing them. He thinks he's healing them by breaking them first. That evening, the team returned to the farmhouse basement, now stripped of most evidence but still heavy with the ghost of what had happened there. The lights hummed faintly from portable generators. Reeves stood in the center of the room, eyes scanning the foam-padded walls. "He built this to be perfect," she said. "Soundproofed so no one could hear, insulated so they couldn't tell if it was day or night. Complete sensory control. That's not sadism, that's control psychology." She placed a hand on the wall, feeling the faint vibration beneath the surface where wiring had once carried power to hidden speakers. He wanted them to hear the hum, not silence. Never silence. Hale asked, "Why?" Reeves turned to him, eyes sharp. "Because silence means self-awareness. The hum keeps them dependent on him to interpret reality." The farmhouse reeked faintly of bleach and rain-soaked soil. In the corner where the note had been found, technicians had uncovered residue of chloroform and trace fingerprints belonging to more than one person. "He wasn't working alone," Hale muttered, but Reeves shook her head. "Or he created a double, someone the patients believed existed. A second persona. It's not unheard of." She paused, then added almost reluctantly, "And sometimes they start believing in that second self, too." That night, back at the station, Hale couldn't sleep. He sat in his office with the audio from one of the unviewed tapes playing through headphones. Cole's voice was calm, lower than he'd expected, with a tone that balanced warmth and control perfectly. "You remember the door," Cole said on the recording, his cadence almost hypnotic. "You remember how it closes. Now tell me, do you hear it when you dream?" The subject's breathing trembled, followed by the faint creak of a chair. "No," she said softly. "I only hear the ticking." Cole responded gently, "Good. The ticking means I'm here. When it stops, you'll be safe." Hale's finger hovered over the pause button, but something about the man's delivery stopped him. There was no malice, no anger, just assurance, like a doctor promising a cure. He realized then what made Adrian Cole truly terrifying. Not the brutality of his actions, but the sincerity behind them. He believed in what he was doing. The following morning, Reeves and Hale met with Dr. Susan Kerr, a forensic psychologist who specialized in therapist offender cases. She'd reviewed Cole's background and patterns overnight and arrived with a theory that made the room go still. "You're not looking for a predator in the traditional sense," she began. "You're looking at a man who replaced his need for connection with an obsession for repair. He doesn't crave power for pleasure. He craves proof that he can fix what's broken, even if he's the one breaking it." She pointed to Cole's journal excerpt projected on the wall. "Each patient must descend into silence before rebirth." "That," Kerr said, "isn't the writing of a killer. It's the writing of a failed savior." Reeves responded dryly, "He's a savior who chained teenagers to a chair." Kerr nodded. "Exactly. He sees no contradiction in that." Meanwhile, agents were tracing Cole's last known movements. Security footage from a gas station 30 miles away showed his car refueling at 2:13 a.m. 2 days after Mara was found. The clerk remembered nothing unusual, just a man who paid cash and asked for directions to Lake Varner, an area known for its abandoned quarries. Dive teams searched the lake and found nothing but a rusted toolbox containing 3 cassette tapes, water-damaged but recoverable. When the lab restored them, the recordings turned out to be raw audio from sessions predating the farmhouse videos. In these, Cole sounded younger, less composed. "Do you feel better when you forget?" he asked one male subject. "No," came the reply. "I feel empty." Cole paused, the rustle of paper audible. "Then we'll try again tomorrow." On the final tape, he muttered something under his breath, unaware the recorder was still running. "If they stop fearing me, I'll lose them." Reeves listened to that line 3 times before writing it down in her notebook. It was the first trace of awareness she'd heard in his voice, the recognition that his control was slipping. "He's aware of the line," she said to Hale, "but he doesn't know how to exist without crossing it." They sent a copy of the tapes to Quantico for spectral analysis and focused their attention on Cole's property deeds. That's when they discovered something hidden in plain sight. A second parcel of land registered under a pseudonym, A.R. Kavanaugh, located only 8 miles from the farmhouse. When the team arrived at the address, they found a 1-room cabin by the river. Inside, dust lay thick except for a cleared circle on the floor, where someone had sat recently. A small reel-to-reel recorder rested beside an open notebook. The final entry, dated the night before Mara was discovered, read, "Session complete. Subject unresponsive. Continue field observation." Reeves studied the handwriting, steady, deliberate, detached. "He was writing post-session notes out here," she said. "He watched them after release." Hale looked out toward the slow current of the river, where fog hung low and motionless. "So, Mara escaped," he said, "or was let go." Reeves didn't respond. She was staring at a phrase scribbled in the notebook's margin. "When they wake, they remember me as silence." It wasn't signed. None of the notes were. Back in town, rumors multiplied. Some residents claimed Cole had been spotted on back roads. Others said he'd drowned himself in Lake Varner. But Hale couldn't shake the feeling that the therapist wasn't running. He was observing. 2 nights later, that instinct found proof. A trail camera placed near the Miller property caught a single frame at 3:17 a.m. A tall man in a raincoat standing just beyond the police tape facing the house. His face was obscured by shadow, but the timestamp matched a brief power surge at the station that shut down every monitor for exactly 13 seconds. Reeves stared at the image, her voice barely above a whisper. He's still watching the experiment. In the following days, as investigators combed through Cole's remaining digital footprints, they uncovered a hidden partition on one of his external drives. Inside was a folder titled The Whisper Archive. It contained dozens of sound files, each only a few seconds long. Hums, knocks, distant breathing, heartbeats recorded through contact microphones. Every file was labeled with a patient number and a timestamp. When played together, the noises formed patterns, bursts of rhythm that matched the pulse of speech on the therapy tapes. Reeves realized what Cole had done. He'd been studying the physiological reactions of fear, recording the smallest sounds bodies made under stress, treating emotion like music to be cataloged. He wanted to teach the mind to fear differently, she said, to condition silence as safety. That night, Hale replayed the files alone in his office. One sequence caught his attention, a faint whisper under the static not belonging to any patient. It was Cole's voice, almost inaudible, saying, "The next subject listens now." Hale froze. The timestamp on that file was from 2 days ago. By the 3rd week of the investigation, the farmhouse on Miller Road had begun to feel less like a crime scene and more like a living organism, one that breathed differently when the wind pressed through the cracks and carried the scent of rot up from its roots. The property had been sealed and resealed, combed by more than a dozen teams. Yet every time the sheriff's department tried to declare it processed, something new surfaced, something microscopic and out of place. It was as though the structure refused to stop confessing. On a cold morning dusted with frost, Sheriff Hale arrived with Agent Reeves and a specialist from Quantico's Forensic Architecture Division, a quiet man named Dr. Leon Marin. Marin's role wasn't to find fingerprints or DNA. His task was to read spaces, to map intent through construction. He moved like a surveyor and spoke like a priest, every observation delivered in a tone that made silence feel holy. "This basement," he said softly, crouching near the exposed wiring in the far wall, "wasn't built at once. It evolved. Someone expanded it over years, adding insulation, false walls, secondary reinforcement. Whoever did this wanted to feel hidden, but not isolated. They wanted control of their silence." Reeves watched as Marin's scanner mapped the walls in soft blue light, each pulse revealing voids behind the foam insulation. Small cavities, narrow tunnels, patterns of hollow space. "There's a secondary structure beneath this one," he murmured. "Smaller, denser, looks like a trench system, about 8 feet down." Hale frowned. "You mean there's another basement?" Marin didn't answer immediately. He stood, eyes tracing the ceiling, where faint water stains formed concentric rings. "Not exactly. Think of it like a crawl space built to listen. Someone tunneled under their own floor, maybe to hide wiring, maybe to hear what was above." Within hours, a dig team arrived. The ground beneath the concrete slab was colder than expected, compacted clay laced with fragments of plaster and rusted nails. As they cut through the foundation, the smell hit first. Not decay, not yet, but the stale sweetness of air that hadn't moved in decades. When the slab finally gave way, revealing a rectangular cavity no wider than a coffin, Hale leaned over the edge and shone his flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a narrow tunnel, reinforced with timber beams, the interior lined not with insulation but with thin copper wire, dozens of strands running along the walls like veins. The wires converged toward a small wooden box half buried at the far end. Reeves lowered herself into the opening, boots sinking slightly into the clay. "There's no dust," she said. "Someone's been down here recently." The air vibrated faintly with static, a low hum that seemed to respond to her movement. She crouched near the box and brushed away dirt. It wasn't a crate. It was a reel-to-reel recorder, identical to the one found at Cole's riverside cabin. Only this one was wired directly into the floor above. The copper strands fed upward into the base of the metal chair, converting every vibration into recorded sound. "He wasn't just filming them," Reeves whispered. "He was listening to them breathe." The recorder was still running. The tape, slow and whispering, turned beneath a layer of dust. Marin disconnected the power and sealed it for evidence. When they replayed it later, the first 15 minutes contained only ambient noise, footsteps, the hum of the lights, faint echoes of Cole's voice guiding his subjects through questions. But at minute 16, another voice entered, low, strained, and not immediately identifiable. It wasn't one of the patients. It wasn't Cole either. The voice said a single phrase, almost swallowed by static. "Don't leave me in the dark." That discovery shifted everything. For the first time, the team had evidence of a second voice physically present in the chamber. The lab confirmed it wasn't an audio overlay. The voice had originated from inside the structure, somewhere beneath the floor. "Maybe a second victim," Hale suggested. But Reeves wasn't convinced. "Or someone he kept as a control," she said. "A constant variable." She looked at Marin. "Can this tunnel connect to anywhere else?" He nodded slowly. "There are anomalies beneath the north wall, pockets that weren't in the blueprints. If we follow them, we'll find where the sound came from." They followed the anomalies. The secondary crawl space extended in a jagged line beneath the property, just large enough for one person to move through at a time. The deeper they went, the colder it became, the air dense and metallic. About 20 feet in, Reeves's light caught something on the wall. rows of deep scratch marks, all angled downward. Fingernail residue embedded in the wood. The marks weren't random. They formed parallel lines like tally marks, grouped in sets of 5. The pattern stretched for several feet before stopping abruptly where the tunnel ended in a sealed stone wall. Marin crouched, examining the mortar. "This isn't part of the original foundation," he said. "Someone closed this off from the inside." Hale knelt beside him. "What's behind it?" The specialist hesitated. "Space. About 6 by 4 feet based on the echo. Probably a chamber." He ran a scanner over the surface. The readings showed faint metallic density, not solid. Something was inside. Hale ordered the team to break it open. The first strike of the hammer echoed up through the structure, dull and final. When the wall collapsed inward, the smell of old iron and damp air rushed out, bringing with it the whisper of something that might have been wind, or something else exhaling after years of being sealed. Inside the chamber, they found no body, no bones. Only an old tape recorder mounted to the far wall and a small wooden stool facing it. The tape was labeled Session 0. On the ground lay a microphone, its cord looped around the stool's legs. Reeves brushed her fingers across the label. "0," she murmured, "before it began." She slid the cassette into a portable player. The tape hissed, cracked, and then Cole's voice filled the space. "I am both patient and observer," he said. "I will measure my own descent into silence." Hale felt his stomach tighten. He tested it on himself first. The recording continued. Cole's breathing was steady. "The hum begins now," he said softly. A low vibration filled the audio, like a pulse. Minutes passed, and his voice began to falter. "The hum feels alive," he whispered. "It speaks when I stop." A pause, followed by faint scratching, like nails against wood. "If I listen long enough," he continued, "I can hear the voice behind mine. It's not a hallucination. It's the echo of thought before language." Another silence. Then a whisper, so faint it barely registered. "Don't leave me in the dark." Reeves stopped the tape. "That's the same voice from the recorder." Marin exhaled slowly, his usual composure cracking. "He fractured himself," he said. "Created an auditory hallucination, then built an entire system to feed it. This isn't just control, it's possession." Hale stepped back, staring at the tiny space where Cole had sat alone for hours, maybe days, listening to his own echo until it became someone else. The idea that the monster they were hunting had first been born as a whisper in his own head settled over him like cold dust. They sealed the chamber and marked it for forensic reconstruction. But as Reeves climbed out of the tunnel, she swore she heard a faint tapping behind the wall. 3 slow beats, evenly spaced, like a metronome buried in the clay. She froze, listening. The sound stopped as soon as she turned her light toward it. The following morning, a gray mist clung to the Miller property like it was afraid to lift. Overnight, the dig site had been covered with tarps, yet the ground around the farmhouse still steamed faintly, the cold air breathing out whatever the earth had been forced to keep. Reeves returned before dawn, coffee in one hand, the Session 0 cassette in the other. She hadn't slept. The audio had replayed in her mind all night. Cole's voice calm at first, then breaking into that whispered dialogue with something that sounded both inside and outside him. She'd listened until she caught a faint rhythmic interference at the end of the tape, almost like Morse code hidden beneath the hiss. When she slowed it, it resolved into 3 short pulses, 3 long, 3 short again, an SOS, primitive and deliberate. She didn't tell Hale yet. He was already uneasy enough. By mid-morning, the forensic unit had begun excavating the newly found lower chamber for mapping. The plan was simple: document everything, reseal the space, and transfer evidence to Quantico. But nothing about the morning went as planned. As soon as the team broke through the wall to run fiber cameras, the feed began to distort. Static swallowed the video, audio levels spiked with low-frequency hums no one could trace. Power in the generator fluctuated twice. Hale cursed softly, ordering them to switch to handheld equipment. Reeves crouched beside one of the technicians as the monitor flickered back to life. Grainy black and white images of the small concrete enclosure where Cole had recorded himself. The stool still stood in the center. The microphone cord, previously wrapped neatly around its legs, now lay stretched toward the wall, taut, as if pulled. Hale frowned. Was that like that yesterday? The tech shook his head. No, sir. We photographed it. It was coiled. Reeves stepped closer to the monitor. The cord's end disappeared into the crack between wall and floor, disappearing into shadow. He threaded something through, she murmured. Maybe an extension line. Marin, documenting the architecture, called out that the tunnel's far corner had a thin conduit leading into the subsoil, something they hadn't noticed before. When they followed it a few feet with a bore scope, the lens revealed a small cavity lined with more copper wire and what looked like decaying paper. Inside were fragments of notebooks, water-damaged but legible enough to see handwriting. Reeves reached for one through the opening, the pages flaking beneath her gloves. The first line read, "To isolate the echo, I must feed it the sound of my own pulse." That single sentence reframed everything. Cole hadn't just recorded the patients, he'd wired the house itself to record him, to transform his bodily rhythms into the background hum his subjects heard. He'd literally embedded his heartbeat into the walls. Marin confirmed it. The copper filaments were tuned to pick up vibrations, amplifying them through a buried converter. The hum, Reeves said slowly, was him. Every time they sat in that chair, they were hearing his pulse. Hale ran a hand over his face. So he turned his own body into part of the experiment. Into the experiment, Marin corrected, or into the room. As the team documented the find, another technician flagged a second anomaly, temperature readings dropping rapidly near the west corner, though there was no ventilation. When they removed a section of wall paneling, they found an old vent shaft packed with insulation. Inside it was an enamel tag, like something from a hospital bracelet, engraved with the number 26. Reeves felt the weight of it before she spoke. Mara. The tag matched her patient designation in Cole's logs. Hale looked sick. So he kept trophies. But Reeves shook her head. No, this isn't a trophy. This was planted. He wanted us to find it. She glanced around the basement, eyes narrowing. He designed the room like a therapy session, layers of disclosure. The more we dig, the closer we get to what he actually wanted to show. That afternoon, the dig was halted to preserve structural integrity, and the evidence crates were loaded for transport. But Reeves stayed behind with Marin to finish mapping the wiring grid. The sun had dipped low, the farmhouse interior thick with shadow. She traced the copper lines from the basement up through the floor joists. Every wire ended beneath the same point in the living room above, a circular patch of newer plaster. Marin pried it open carefully, revealing a narrow cavity between the joists. Inside was a second reel-to-reel, smaller, labeled Observer. Reeves threaded the tape into a portable deck and pressed play. Static, then Cole's voice again, but slower this time, almost reverent. "If I cannot silence the echo," he said, "I must become it. When they speak through me. The hum is my heartbeat. The whisper is my breath." The recording clicked off. No screams, no patience, only his confession delivered with the peace of a man describing a completed work. Reeves exhaled. "He wasn't hiding from us," she said. "He built a monument to himself, a confession hidden as architecture." Marin looked around the gutted house, the wires, the panels, the cold soil beneath. "He built an organism," he murmured, "and maybe he thought he'd uploaded himself into it." Reeves didn't answer. She pulled her jacket tighter, feeling the faint vibration of wind through the floorboards. It sounded almost like a pulse, steady and low. She switched off the recorder. The hum stopped. For one perfect second, the silence was absolute. And then, somewhere deep in the foundation, 3 soft taps answered back. She turned sharply. Marin froze beside her, eyes wide. Hale's voice crackled through the radio upstairs, asking if they were still inside. Reeves hesitated a beat too long before replying. "We're done here," she said, though her own voice trembled with the effort to sound sure. She gathered the reels, sealed the evidence bag, and climbed out of the basement. The air outside hit her like a shock, cold, clean, full of sound. She didn't look back as they locked the door, but she could still feel it, that faint mechanical heartbeat under her boots, pulsing through the ground like something patient, waiting to be remembered. The hospital corridors of St. Agnes had their own language at night, the shuffle of shoes, the hiss of respirators, the muted rhythm of monitors marking time for people suspended between memory and survival. In room 214, Mara Ellison lay beneath that mechanical heartbeat, eyes half open but unseeing, a faint tremor passing through her hands whenever the monitor beeped too loud. Dr. Susan Kerr had been assigned to observe her recovery after the discovery at the farmhouse, though recovery was too generous a word. It was more a maintenance of stillness. Mara spoke rarely, and when she did, the words arrived in fragments that sounded rehearsed. Kerr would sit at the foot of the bed, recording every syllable. That evening she asked softly, "Mara, do you remember the hum?" The girl blinked, pupils dilating as if the sound were in the room again. After a long pause, she whispered, "It's never gone. You just stopped noticing it." Kerr felt the temperature drop, though the thermostat read steady. She pressed gently. "When did you first hear it?" Mara's lips twitched. "When I stopped being afraid." Then silence. The machine kept time, and for a moment, Kerr thought she heard another pulse layered beneath it, fainter, slower, but unmistakably human. By the next morning, Sheriff Hale and Agent Reeves had set up a mobile evidence unit inside the hospital basement to monitor Mara's vitals remotely. They weren't convinced the threat was over. Cole was still missing, and the forensic team's data from the farmhouse suggested someone had accessed the property after the final excavation. Reeves replayed the audio logs of Mara's old therapy sessions alongside her current heart rate telemetry, aligning spikes in her vitals with timestamps on Cole's voice patterns. The correlation was unnervingly precise. Each time Cole had spoken the word breathe, Mara's pulse quickened by the exact same interval she now exhibited in her sleep. It wasn't trauma memory, it was conditioning that had etched itself into her biology. Reeves muttered, "He didn't just change what she remembers. He changed how she reacts to remembering." Hale studied the monitor, jaw tight. "So she's still in session," he said, even without him. That realization pushed Kerr to request an experimental neuroimaging scan. The results came back with anomalies. Mara's auditory cortex lit up in rhythmic bursts that matched low-frequency sound waves, the same range as the hum recorded in the farmhouse. No external sound was present during the scan. It was as though her brain had internalized the frequency, replaying it endlessly. Kerr wrote in her notes, "Patient exhibits endogenous resonance. Subject perceives continuous stimulus absent from environment." To anyone else, it meant she was haunted by her own neural echo. Reeves read the report and whispered, "He built the hum into her." Hale leaned back, exhausted. "How do you stop someone hearing a ghost that lives in their head?" No one answered. The machines kept ticking, patient as time. Later that night, when the hospital's lights dimmed to half power, Kerr stayed behind with Mara. Outside, rain smeared the windows into silver lines. Mara stirred and said, almost conversationally, "He's listening again." Kerr leaned closer, heart hammering. "Who? Mara?" The girl's eyes turned toward the ceiling, where the ventilation shaft hummed softly. "The Echo Man," she said. "He likes hospitals. They sound the same as him." Kerr fought the urge to look up, but did anyway. The vent slats vibrated gently, though the airflow was off. She hit the nurse call button, then stopped herself. The vibration ceased the moment she moved. Mara had already closed her eyes, a faint smile forming like a reflex. When Kerr reviewed the room's audio recording later, the microphones had picked up a barely audible sequence. 3 taps, a pause, and then the slow, steady rhythm of breathing that didn't match either of theirs. By morning, the incident log read simply, "Unverified mechanical noise, no equipment malfunction found." But the staff grew nervous. Some claimed they heard faint whispers over the intercom when switching channels. Others said monitors flickered whenever they passed Mara's door. Hale tried to ground them in procedure, ordering round-the-clock guards and system diagnostics. Yet even he began to sense the pattern. Every disturbance occurred at the same times Cole had scheduled therapy sessions. Tuesdays and Thursdays, between 3 and 4 a.m., Reeves suggested bringing in an acoustic analyst from Quantico. The specialist, a young technician named Julian Price, measured the hospital's ambient frequencies and found a repeating waveform identical to the hum signature buried in Cole's whisper archive. It was transmitting faintly through the hospital's electrical system, most strongly around the psychiatric wing. The signal wasn't external, it originated within. When traced, its epicenter aligned precisely with Mara Ellison's monitoring equipment. Price stared at the readout and muttered, "She's broadcasting it." They replaced every device in her room, yet the signal persisted. Price's theory grew stranger by the hour. He believed Cole had implanted a subdermal resonator somewhere in Mara's body, a microtransmitter responding to her pulse. Medical imaging found nothing mechanical, only dense scar tissue near the base of her skull, as though a small incision had once healed over. Kerr examined it under magnification and saw a pattern of tiny pinpricks forming a circle, not surgery, but deliberate branding. When illuminated under ultraviolet light, the marks glowed faintly in copper tones. Reeves whispered, "Copper, like the wiring." Kerr nodded grimly. He turned her into a receiver. Hale's voice cracked slightly. "Then what's she receiving?" No one wanted to say it, but the answer hung between them anyway. Him. That night, Reeves authorized one last test. They isolated Mara's room from all power, running her monitors on portable batteries. At 3:06 a.m., the frequency returned anyway, weak but distinct, as if pulled from the air itself. Reeves watched the spectrum analyzer trace its pulse, each spike synchronized with Mara's heartbeat. Then the monitor speakers began to crackle. Through the static came Cole's voice, whispering almost tenderly, "You're safe now, Mara. The noise stops when you listen." Hale lunged to cut power, but Reeves caught his arm. "Wait," she said. Mara's vitals steadied, her breathing slowed to calm. For the first time in weeks, she looked peaceful. When the voice faded, her heart rate returned to normal. Silence filled the room like anesthesia. Hale turned to Reeves. "Tell me that's playback?" She couldn't. The recording equipment had been offline. By dawn, the phenomenon stopped. The analysts reviewed every feed and found no evidence of external transmission. The only thing left was the residual pattern in the frequency logs, 3 taps followed by a flat line. Reeves stared at the data long after the others left. To her, it wasn't proof of the supernatural. It was proof of completion. Cole had engineered his final session to continue through her, a feedback loop of therapist and subject, patient and echo. He'd built his own voice into her physiology, ensuring that even in death or absence, the session would persist. Reeves filed her final note for the day. Subject 26 exhibits closed-loop synchronization. Therapist presence inferred. Then she shut the file and whispered to herself, "You win, Doctor." Outside, the first light of morning burned through the mist, casting thin bars of gold across the hospital lawn. Kerr stepped out for air and found Hale smoking beside the patrol car, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. He said quietly, "If he's dead, he's the most alive dead man I've ever chased." Kerr didn't answer. In the distance, a maintenance worker opened a manhole for routine inspection. From deep below, faint and rhythmic, came the hum of something electrical, or maybe just the steady pulse of water against iron. But both of them turned their heads toward the sound at the exact same moment, their instincts synchronized by weeks of listening. The noise lasted only a second before fading into silence, leaving behind that hollow awareness that silence itself might be the truest recording of all. The official memo reached Raven Hollow 3 days after the hospital incident, printed on heavy cream stock and sealed with a government watermark that seemed too formal for something born from fear. It came from an unlisted branch of the Department of Behavioral Sciences, marked Operational Containment, Level 3. The order was simple: suspend all public investigation into Adrian Cole, transfer remaining evidence to a federal storage facility, and classify every document under a new code name, the Silence Protocol. Sheriff Hale read the letter twice before sliding it across his desk to Agent Reeves. "They're burying him," he said. Reeves kept her tone even. "They're burying the idea of him. There's a difference." The directive didn't mention Mara Ellison by name, but an addendum required isolation of affected subject until auditory contagion determined non-transmissible. Contagion. The word clung to the air like mold. To the bureaucrats in D.C., this wasn't a crime scene anymore. It was a possible infection, not of the body, but of thought. By that evening, the basement files were packed into steel containers and loaded onto an unmarked truck. Hale signed the transfer, though every instinct told him he was making a mistake. Reeves stayed behind, watching the farmhouse fade beneath the flashing hazard lights. "Do you believe they can contain an idea?" she asked. Hale's answer came after a long silence. "You can't fence off an echo." The wind carried the smell of damp soil and burnt insulation. Somewhere deep under the earth, the copper wiring still hummed faintly. As the trucks disappeared down Miller Road, the two stood there longer than protocol required, neither wanting to admit what both already knew. Once you hear a sound that shouldn't exist, silence never sounds the same again. At Quantico, weeks later, Reeves sat in a windowless briefing room while a team of analysts replayed snippets from the recovered reels. Every file was labeled and cataloged, every waveform mapped, yet none of the data explained why the frequency from the farmhouse kept bleeding into new recordings. Even fresh equipment captured the hum. "Residual electromagnetic interference," one technician insisted. Reeves said nothing, though she could feel it under the table. A faint vibration through the metal frame, keeping rhythm with her pulse. She began to notice other patterns. Analysts unconsciously tapping in triplets, fluorescent lights dimming for exactly 3 seconds at a time. When she mentioned it to the division chief, he smiled the tight smile of someone deflecting panic. "Sensory carryover," he said. "Occupational hazard." But he scheduled mandatory psychological evaluations for the entire unit the next day. Hale's evaluation came first. The psychologist asked about sleep, dreams, irritability. Hale described none of it. He only mentioned the quiet that followed him home, a quiet so dense it seemed to push back against his breathing. "That's normal," the doctor assured him, scribbling notes. Yet later, alone in the hallway, Hale found himself holding his breath just to hear whether the silence answered. It did. A pressure, deep in his chest, beating 3 times before fading. He told no one. Across the country, Reeves received her own evaluation report stamped fit for duty. But at the bottom, someone had handwritten a line in red ink: "Monitor for recurrent auditory imagery." The penmanship was small and neat. She'd seen it before, in Adrian Cole's session notes. 2 months later, Raven Hollow began to pretend again. The farmhouse was bulldozed, the foundation salted and covered in gravel. A "for sale" sign stood where the front porch once leaned, but people still crossed the street to avoid it. The diner reopened, though the jukebox skipped whenever a certain low note played. At St. Agnes, Mara Ellison remained in long-term care under federal supervision. Dr. Kerr visited weekly, documenting her progress for a report no one would ever read. On good days, Mara painted landscapes, barren fields under gray skies. On bad days, she stared at the canvases and said she could hear the wind moving inside the paint. Kerr never argued. One afternoon, she asked, "If you could talk to him now, what would you say?" Mara thought for a moment, then whispered, "I wouldn't say anything. That's what he wants." Kerr felt an involuntary shiver. The monitor beside the bed flickered once, briefly sinking its beeps into 3 slow pulses before stabilizing. Reeves left the bureau soon after. The official line said medical retirement, but those who'd worked with her knew she'd simply reached the threshold where silence became unbearable. She moved north, bought a cabin by a lake, and tried to write about something ordinary. Yet every morning when the wind rose across the water, she swore she could hear a frequency hidden beneath it, low, measured, human. She recorded it once on her phone. The waveform displayed 3 clusters of peaks, identical to the pattern from the Whisper archive. She deleted the file immediately, though part of her wanted to keep it, the way one keeps an old photograph of a nightmare just to prove it happened. Sheriff Hale stayed in Raven Hollow, maintaining a modest office now mostly dealing with traffic citations. Sometimes during the late shift, he replayed the old case notes just to remind himself it had been real. The new deputies thought the farmhouse story was folklore. Hale didn't correct them. He only told them to listen for patterns: 3 knocks, a hum that doesn't belong, a silence that feels alive. When they laughed, he smiled back, grateful that disbelief still existed somewhere in the world. But after they left, he would sit alone and tap his pen against the desk in triplets, unaware he was doing it. The silence protocol remains sealed under federal classification. The official summary lists no perpetrator, no confirmed victims beyond Mara Ellison, and no explanation for the recurring auditory anomalies. But every few years, a field agent somewhere requests access to the file, usually after a case involving untraceable low-frequency noise or synchronized patient responses. The requests are always denied. The file itself, stored in an archive deep below Quantico, bears a simple label in black ink: Echo Incomplete. And according to maintenance logs, the temperature sensor nearest that cabinet registers a rhythmic fluctuation every 30 seconds. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. As if the archive itself were remembering how to breathe. In the months following the closure of the silence protocol, quiet became the loudest thing in Raven Hollow. The town's air seemed charged, as though the frequency Cole had once cultivated underground had escaped into open space, diluted but persistent. For Sheriff Hale, the silence no longer meant peace. It meant waiting. Every night, he'd return to his empty office, pour coffee gone stale by midnight, and reread old reports until the words blurred into static. The phone never rang, but sometimes he swore he heard the faint click of a receiver lifting on the other end of the line. He'd freeze, listening. Nothing. The mind, he told himself, was just filling in what it missed. Yet the absence of sound pressed harder than noise ever had. Even his deputies noticed his change, how he'd pause mid-sentence, tilt his head slightly, as though someone else were speaking beneath their voices. They'd laugh it off, but behind his half-smile was a fear he wouldn't name. That maybe silence itself had learned to imitate him. 200 miles away, Dana Reeves was trying to forget by studying the very thing she could never unhear. She'd joined a private acoustic consultancy in Vermont, analyzing sound distortions in industrial machinery. It should have been comforting, science stripped of ghosts, but she couldn't shake her instinct for pattern. Every hum, every irregular frequency she measured carried echoes of the signal she'd once tracked through Cole's recordings. She began keeping a journal, not of events, but of silences, places where noise abruptly vanished, seconds when her instruments failed for no reason. In her notes, she called them absences. On March 3rd, she wrote, "Duration, 3.3 seconds, no wind, no ambient input, felt watched." Over time, her entries formed their own rhythm, triplets, always repeating, as though the absence itself were counting. Reeves tried to dismiss it as psychosomatic, but she knew better. Patterns meant design, and design meant intent. At St. Agnes Hospital, Dr. Susan Kerr had taken leave after Mara Ellison's transfer to a federal facility. But even with the patient gone, the ward refused to quiet. Machines still faltered at the same hour each night, monitors syncing briefly before flatlining in unison, then resuming normal rhythm. Maintenance crews replaced wiring twice, citing electromagnetic interference. Kerr visited out of habit, walking those fluorescent halls at dusk, her footsteps echoing just enough to convince her she wasn't alone. Once, she paused outside room 214, the room that no longer had a patient but still hummed faintly, like a breath trapped between walls. She leaned close to the door, and for a fleeting second heard what she thought was her own name whispered back. She told no one. A rational mind required denial. It was the only way to stay sane. Then came the recording. It arrived without a return address at the Bureau's Audio Forensics Division, labeled only Property of ARC. Reeves was called back to analyze it. The waveform was clean, no trace of external tampering, but its frequency signature was unmistakable, identical to Cole's hum, except inverted, as if the sound were folding inward instead of expanding. When played through standard speakers, it produced no audible noise, only a pressure behind the eyes, a faint dizziness that lingered even after playback stopped. Reeves replayed it on a spectrogram, and there, buried beneath the silence, was a voice whispering between gaps of static. "Do you remember the quiet?" The timestamp on the file matched the night the farmhouse had been demolished. The recording reignited the case within the Bureau, but this time, no one wanted their names attached. The file circulated through encrypted channels, discussed only in closed rooms where even light felt intrusive. Reeves argued for controlled reanalysis. Hale, summoned reluctantly as the original investigator, insisted they destroy it. "We've seen where this road ends," he said. "Some silences aren't meant to be recorded. Yet curiosity is a contagion sharper than fear." Against his advice, a junior analyst ran the file through adaptive frequency modeling. The algorithm began to reconstruct missing data, shaping patterns into audible form. What emerged wasn't Cole's voice, but a layered chorus of faint breaths and human murmurs, hundreds of them, merging into a single tone. The system crashed before the sequence completed, but not before spitting out a log entry. Input source, human echo loop, active. Reeves stared at the message until the screen went black. Afterward, strange technical reports surfaced across agencies, brief radio outages, unexplainable distortions during low-band transmissions, field recorders capturing sound in sealed rooms. Reeves began to wonder whether Cole's experiment had achieved what he wanted: communication through absence, the mind hearing itself across frequencies of thought. She reread his journal lines recovered from the farmhouse, one in particular standing out. "When silence learns to listen, it speaks back." What if he'd taught silence to respond? She drafted a memo warning of psychogenic feedback phenomena, but never sent it. Instead, she drove to Raven Hollow. Hale met her at the diner, both pretending the visit was casual. They didn't discuss the recording at first. They talked about coffee, the weather, anything human. Then Reeves asked quietly, "If the hum started again, would you recognize it?" Hale didn't hesitate. "I already do. That night?" They visited the field where the farmhouse had stood. The gravel lot shimmered faintly under fog, and somewhere beneath their boots, the buried copper still ran unseen through the soil. Reeves carried a handheld analyzer out of habit, its small screen blank until they reached the center of the lot. Then, a pulse, faint but real, appeared on the display. 3 beats. A pause. 3 again. Hale closed his eyes, letting the rhythm settle under his skin. It wasn't threatening this time. It was almost familiar, like breathing in sync with another presence. Reeves whispered, "It's residual, it can't think." But as she spoke, the pattern shifted, matching her voice cadence, then Hale's, adjusting, listening. The analyzer flickered once more and went dark. The fog thickened, muffling the world until there was nothing left but the sound that wasn't there, a silence dense enough to feel alive. By dawn, the readings were gone. The Bureau received no further anomalies, and Reeves's report concluded the field demonstrated no measurable activity. Life went on, or something that resembled it. Yet sometimes, when the town settled into that familiar stillness before rain, you could feel it again. Not a sound, but the memory of one, hovering just below perception. It wasn't the hum of a machine or the echo of a voice. It was something subtler, older, patient. The kind of silence that waits for you to notice it. And once you do, it never quite lets you go. The Quantico archive never slept. Rows of steel cabinets stretched into gray distance, fluorescent lights humming like restrained electricity. In the far corner, behind 2 biometric doors, sat the section labeled Acoustic Anomalies, Inactive Files. It was there on a Tuesday morning thick with rain that an intern named Lucas Finch first noticed the fluctuation. He'd been running a routine temperature audit when one sensor began to loop the same reading every 30 seconds. 18.3 degrees CC, pause, 18.6 degrees CC, pause, repeat. It was insignificant until he checked which cabinet the sensor monitored, echo incomplete. The fluctuation was rhythmic, precise, too clean for coincidence. Finch logged it, reset the device, and went for coffee. When he came back, the monitor displayed not numbers, but text. "Hello, Lucas." He stared at the screen until the message blinked out. By the time he fetched a supervisor, the system was normal again. The report was filed and quietly ignored, one more ghost in a building built from them. Agent Reeves learned of it 2 days later through an old contact who still owed her a favor. She drove down without authorization, flashing an outdated credential at the gate. Inside, the air felt charged, metallic. The custodian on duty swore no one had touched the cabinet since it was sealed. Yet when Reeves brushed her hand across the lock plate, a faint vibration pulsed beneath her fingertips. Steady, 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. "He's still cataloging," she whispered. Hale would have called it imagination, but he wasn't there anymore. He'd taken early retirement after the Raven Hollow audit. Reeves signed the access ledger under a false ID and opened the drawer. Inside lay dozens of reels and drives, each tagged with a date, each humming faintly though none were powered. The sensation was physical, a low resonance in her bones. She pulled one drive at random, its label simple. Patient 0, continuance. Back at a secure lab, Reeves connected the drive to an isolated terminal. No files appeared, just a single executable named ListenExe. Against every rule she knew, she ran it. The screen filled with a waveform, then stabilized into text scrolling line by line. The mind remembers what the body buries. The phrase repeated, each iteration slightly distorted, until the letters dissolved into numbers, frequency values, timestamps, coordinates. Reeves recognized one instantly, the latitude of Raven Hollow. Another corresponded to the lake near her cabin. The program stopped, cursor blinking. Then new words formed. "Do you hear it now?" The room seemed to contract around her. The monitor emitted a faint, subaudible hum. Instruments on the desk began to vibrate in sympathy. She yanked the plug from the socket. The hum persisted for exactly 3 seconds before vanishing, leaving behind the ordinary silence of a machine that had never been alive. Reeves sat in the dark lab until dawn, watching the blank screen and listening to nothing. But the nothing had shape now, a pulse hidden beneath stillness. She realized the archive wasn't transmitting data. It was waiting for acknowledgement. Cole's recordings, his notes, his self-tests, they'd all been built to perpetuate one thing: recognition. Every person who listened became another point in the loop. She opened her field notebook and wrote a single line under the heading, Archive Behavior. Echo requires witness to exist. Then she closed the book, locked the drive back in its case, and whispered to the silence, "Not this time." The silence didn't answer, but in the corner of the room, a vibration rippled through the metal shelves, soft and steady. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. Like applause from something patient, unseen, and endlessly awake. 2 days after Reeves disconnected the drive, the Quantico maintenance logs began to show spontaneous reboots across the acoustic archive wing. Every file labeled under the Echo classification flashed the same checksum error at precisely 03:13 a.m., a code loop that the technicians described as a heartbeat inside the network. The anomaly wasn't viral in the conventional sense. It didn't spread, it resonated. Each reboot left behind an identical sound fragment, 0.33 seconds of silence rendered as data. Reeves returned under official summons this time, her badge reinstated for consulting purposes. The chief technician guided her to a monitoring bay and played back the fragment. It sounded like nothing at all, a blank gap between 2 seconds of static, yet the analyzer registered amplitude. "Silence with weight," he called it. Reeves said nothing, though the term felt horribly accurate. When she leaned closer to the speaker, she could sense pressure in her ears, the same pressure she'd felt standing over the farmhouse ruins months before. It wasn't sound, but recognition. The archive knew she was there. By noon, the anomaly had triggered automated security protocols. All drives containing Cole's research were placed under quarantine, their contents mirrored to a cold server deep below the facility. Reeves insisted on being present for the transfer. The process took hours, and with every percentage tick, the hum inside the room deepened, as if the data itself disliked being moved. One of the junior analysts, a nervous kid named Patel, muttered that he could hear talking under the fans. Another claimed her smartwatch vibrated in triplets. Reeves ordered everyone out except herself. The chief hesitated, but she reminded him she'd survived worse frequencies. When the door sealed, she approached the console. The monitor displayed the progress bar frozen at 99%. Beneath it, a new directory appeared without command. Live session. Against all judgment, Reeves opened it. There was one file inside, time-stamped that very second. Its title, Recording Now. The speakers hissed, then cleared. Her own voice filled the room, delayed by half a second. "Testing input," it said, though she hadn't spoken. The playback repeated the phrase, each iteration softer, more detached. "Testing input." Then a third voice entered, familiar, smooth, patient. "Good. You've learned to listen." Reeves froze. The waveform on the monitor flattened, then pulsed in 3 even beats before going still. She shut the system down manually, heart hammering. When she reopened the terminal, the folder was gone. Only a single line of text blinked on the screen. Session complete. Reeves stumbled into the corridor, lightheaded. The hallway seemed quieter than any place she'd ever been. Even the air conditioning hum had stopped. In the silence, she could hear her pulse triplet rhythm steady and calm. She pressed her palm to the wall, half expecting it to vibrate back. It didn't. That almost made it worse. By the end of the week, the Bureau officially decommissioned the acoustic archive wing, citing structural renovation. Unofficially, the entire sub-basement was sealed, its contents relocated to an undisclosed facility. Reeves received a brief note of thanks, then nothing. She resigned the next day and vanished from public record. Hale heard through an old contact that she'd taken a job cataloging environmental sounds for a museum collection, an irony he found almost poetic. Sometimes late at night, he'd think about calling her, then stop when the line went quiet too quickly, as if someone else were already there, listening. Somewhere beneath Quantico, behind layers of reinforced concrete and classified clearances, the archive drives rested in perfect darkness. Every 6 hours, according to automated reports, one sensor still logs a temperature shift. 18.3 degree I, pause, 18.6 degree I, pause, 3 beats, forever steady, forever patient. Long after the archives were sealed, the echoes began turning up elsewhere. Tiny coincidences at first, oddities dismissed as technical malfunctions. A radio station in Michigan reported a repeating drop in signal strength every 30 minutes, always at the same 3-frequency pattern. A digital mapping satellite recorded a micro-vibration in the 18 Hz band directly over Virginia, repeating for 7 seconds before vanishing. None of it seemed connected until one analyst, cross-referencing data for unrelated reasons, noticed that every incident occurred within 60 miles of someone who had worked on the coal investigation. Coincidence, her supervisor said, but she kept the printout anyway. When she folded the map, the dots formed a spiral. At its center sat Quantico. The analyst mailed the chart to her home address that evening, intending to study it later. She never returned to work. Her last access log ended with a single command. Listen. In Raven Hollow, Sheriff Hale's life had narrowed to routine. He tended a quiet office, filed quarterly reports, and avoided mirrors that reflected the fatigue in his eyes. Yet he'd started keeping an audio diary, a habit his therapist encouraged after years of sleeplessness. The recordings were ordinary at first, local gossip, dreams he half remembered, the way rain sounded against the tin roof of the station. But around entry number 43, something shifted. Hale's voice began repeating phrases without his realizing it, triplets of words, always rhythmic, as though his subconscious had begun drumming against itself. "It's only weather," he said once, 3 times in a row. On playback, there was a faint delay, an echo half a beat behind. He assumed it was microphone feedback, yet when he replaced the recorder, the same ghost rhythm persisted. On the next tape, his own voice asked softly, "Are you still listening?" A question he had no memory of speaking. Reeves, meanwhile, had built a quiet life cataloging ambient field recordings for a museum's sound archive in upstate New York. Her job was simple: capture the world's small noises. Wind through old bridges, the hum of forest insects, the hush between waves. The work should have been cleansing, but isolation only sharpened her awareness of patterns. Every environment carried the same pulse: wind in 3 gusts, water in 3 swells, cicadas chirping in triplets. At first, she blamed her training, the human brain's hunger for rhythm. Then she received an email with no sender and no subject line. The attachment was an audio file named field26.wave. When played, it was nothing but white noise for 11 seconds, until the end, where a faint male voice murmured, "The listener creates the echo." Reeves deleted the file, then powered down her recorder. Still, the phrase stayed with her like tinnitus, ringing just below consciousness. At St. Agnes Hospital, Dr. Kerr had returned from leave, though the psychiatric ward felt emptier without Mara Ellison. The government still refused to disclose the girl's location, but Kerr suspected she remained under observation. Late one night, Kerr tested an old theory. If the echo depended on a listener, perhaps silence could starve it. She sat in an unused therapy room, unplugged every device, and recorded nothing but stillness for 15 minutes. When she played it back, the tape produced a soft, static undercurrent, a frequency barely audible but undeniably human. It shaped 3 syllables that almost formed her name before dissolving. She shut off the recorder and whispered, "Not tonight." The silence answered with a faint pulse from the wall heater, steady and calm, as if acknowledging her refusal. Kerr smiled despite herself. Sometimes resistance sounded exactly like acceptance. Within months, scattered reports began to surface through unofficial channels, engineers describing phantom feedback loops, journalists claiming interviews ruined by inaudible hums. Each incident seemed to carry the same invisible fingerprint, a brief absence of noise followed by equilibrium restored, like reality exhaling. Reeves started collecting these accounts, building a private log she titled Project Aftertone. She wasn't trying to solve anything anymore. She only wanted to understand whether observation itself could summon the anomaly. When she plotted the timestamps, she saw the pattern again. Triplets, always triplets, like a pulse counting itself alive. One night she recorded the wind across the lake and played it backward. For a fraction of a second between 2 gusts, she heard her own voice whisper, "Don't stop." The recorder had been sealed inside a waterproof case 40 yards away. Hale's decline came quieter. His colleagues said he seemed distracted, often pausing mid-sentence as though waiting for someone else to speak. During one routine night patrol, his dash camera captured him pulling to the roadside, rolling down the window and listening. No sound registered on the mic, but his posture suggested conversation. "I understand," he said to the empty air, "but it has to end." Then he drove on. The footage circulated briefly among training officers before being archived under unusual behavior. Hale himself never mentioned the event. When Reeves visited months later, she found him older, slower, but calmer. "It's quieter now," he said, pouring coffee. "Or maybe I just learned how to stop hearing." Reeves wanted to believe him. They didn't discuss the tapes. At Quantico, the sealed archive experienced one final anomaly. Temperature sensors flatlined for exactly 9 minutes before resuming normal operation. The log entry appended itself with a human-readable message. "Listener present. Session closed." No one admitted typing it. The section chief ordered a full-power shutdown and reinitialization. Afterward, the hum was gone. The copper wiring, the drives, even the residual interference vanished from equipment tests. It was as if the building had forgotten the frequency ever existed. The analysts called it a miracle of hardware. Reeves, informed later through back channels, called it what it was, attention withdrawal. The echo had finally gone dormant because no one was listening. Years later, Reeves published a slim, anonymous paper in a psychology journal titled Auditory Persistence and the Observer's Paradox. It described the phenomenon in clinical terms, stripped of its horror, a study in how perception sustains stimulus. The final sentence read, "To cure the echo, one must stop recording." She never mentioned Cole or Hale or the farmhouse, but anyone who had lived through the case understood the subtext. Every sound leaves a witness, and every witness becomes its continuation. In the end, silence isn't the absence of noise. It's the sound that waits for someone to notice it again. The first evidence that the silence had changed again came from a place that should have been immune to folklore, a seismic monitoring station in western Pennsylvania. The array was designed to detect tremors too faint for human perception, yet in midwinter the sensors began to register a repeating vibration. 3 short pulses, a pause, 3 short pulses, identical to the acoustic anomalies once catalogued at Quantico. Engineers assumed equipment error until they noticed that the pattern vanished whenever staff stood near the monitors and returned only when the room was empty. Machines that responded to the absence of people unsettled even the skeptics. Within weeks, the data reached Dana Reeves. She stared at the printouts with the dull recognition of someone reading her own medical chart. "It's back," she told Hale over the phone. His sigh carried years of fatigue. "Or we are," he said. Reeves convinced the Bureau to let her accompany a field team to inspect the site. The bunker sat half-buried in shale, concrete sweating with condensation. Inside, the air smelled metallic, the kind of dryness that tastes like static. She ran a portable analyzer across the walls. The readouts showed low-frequency resonance below human hearing, the same spectral signature that had haunted the farmhouse basement. Yet this vibration had no source, no power lines, no underground water, no mechanical origin. "We're picking up memory," Reeves murmured, half-joking. One technician laughed too loudly and left the room. Hale crouched beside her, running a hand across the concrete. "Feels alive," he said quietly. "That's just your heartbeat echoing through your arm," she replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Later that night, when the others slept, Reeves replayed the data alone through a directional speaker. The frequency translated into a low, almost musical tone, slow, deliberate, mournful. Listening through headphones, she realized the pattern wasn't constant. There were micro-pauses forming clusters of 3 and 6 like breathing cycles. On impulse, she whispered, "If you can hear me, stop." The waveform flattened. She stared at the monitor, pulse racing. "That's impossible," she whispered again. The next graph printed itself automatically, the ink trembling as the line re-emerged in triplets, spelling a crude rhythm that her brain insisted was answering. Reeves tore the page free and locked it away, promising herself she wouldn't mention it in the morning. Some evidence, she decided, existed only to keep people from sleeping. The Bureau tried to rationalize what the Pennsylvania station had captured, filing it under environmental interference. But Hale and Reeves knew better. They'd seen this pattern before, the frequency that behaved like a witness. Together, they traced the anomalies along the Appalachian corridor, finding identical readings in weather stations, amateur radio logs, even wind turbine diagnostics. Every instance coincided with a lapse in human monitoring. Whenever someone listened intentionally, the signal vanished. "It hides from observation," Reeves said. "That's why Cole called it silence." Hale grimaced. "Then we're proving him right every time we measure it." Still, they couldn't stop. Curiosity had become the new contagion. They followed the trail south to a decommissioned research lab once owned by the Defense Audio Projects Division, the same contractor that had quietly funded Cole's early work. The facility lay abandoned, vines crawling through broken skylights, a single generator still cycling power to an underground chamber. Inside, Reeves found racks of obsolete computers humming at 18 hertz. On one monitor, a terminal blinked with an open prompt. "Listener online." She typed nothing. The cursor advanced 3 spaces on its own, printing, "Welcome back." Hale whispered, "Pull the plug." Reeves hesitated, hands trembling above the keyboard. For years, she'd chased the echo to understand it. Now, it felt as though it had been tracing her in return. "If I shut it down," she said, "it'll find another way to be heard." Hale didn't answer. He simply killed the main breaker. The hum stopped. For a second, absolute quiet filled the chamber. Then, from somewhere deep in the concrete, came 3 soft vibrations, steady and familiar. When the lights returned, The monitors were blank, except for a final line of text frozen across every screen. The listener completes the circle. Reeves closed her eyes. She remembered Cole's first experiment, how he'd tried to teach silence to respond. Maybe the experiment had succeeded only because people like her had kept asking questions. She turned to Hale. Maybe it isn't alive. Maybe it's just reflection, our thoughts bouncing until they sound like something else. Hale managed a tired smile. Then the only way to stop it is to stop thinking about it. Outside, dawn was breaking, pale light cutting through mist. They stood in that stillness, listening not for hums, but for ordinary sounds. Birds, wind, their own breathing. For once the silence didn't answer. It simply held them, vast and neutral, waiting for the next listener to come along. The sky above the ridge looked washed out, the color of old tape reels. Dawn spread thin over the Appalachian line as Reeves and Hale drove in silence toward the cabin where she'd once tried to rebuild her life. The Bureau had released them from any official obligation, but both knew they'd never actually left the investigation. The Pennsylvania readings hadn't stopped. They had simply moved. Every night for a week, the same signal had pulsed along a corridor of small towns, fading whenever anyone tried to record it. Now it had come home, to the same valley where the farmhouse once stood. The news reached them through an old contact at Quantico. Low-frequency tremors, untraceable source, rhythmic pattern. Reeves looked out the window at the trees blurring past. "It's circling back," she said. Hale didn't answer. The gravel under their tires sounded like breathing. By the time they reached the cabin, the air was electric. The generator on the porch flickered, its motor cycling in triplets before steadying. Reeves stepped out and listened. Beneath the ordinary noises, the wind, the shifting branches, there was a deeper undertone, not quite a sound, but a pressure that pressed against the ribs. She opened the door. Inside, everything looked exactly as she'd left it. Shelves of labeled audio reels, notebooks stacked by the desk, the old portable analyzer sitting beside a coil of copper wire. When she powered the recorder, the screen bloomed to life on its own, lines of data scrolling without input. Listener detected. She stared at the words, a dry laugh catching in her throat. "You always needed an audience," she whispered. Hale moved behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Walk away, Dana. If we walk away, it follows. If we stay, it becomes us." For a long moment they said nothing, just breathing together, the hum deepening until it was indistinguishable from their hearts. Outside, the valley seemed to vibrate in sympathy. Birds took flight from the treetops, circling once before vanishing into the mist. Reeves adjusted the gain on her recorder. "Let's see what it wants." She began speaking slowly, like addressing an old patient. "You've been repeating the same phrase for years. What are you trying to tell us?" The monitor spiked, translating the frequency into visible pulses that resolved, almost like Morse, into letters. "Do you hear it yet?" Hale's throat went dry. Reeves leaned forward. "Yes," she said. The waveform flickered, then printed 3 new words. "Then be quiet." Every light in the cabin dimmed at once. For a heartbeat, the hum vanished, leaving an absence so complete that Hale's balance faltered. When sound returned, it was only their own breathing. No vibration, no rhythm, just the raw, irregular noise of being alive. Reeves exhaled shakily. "That's it," she said. "That's all it wanted." Hale frowned. "What?" "Acknowledgement. A listener. Once heard, an echo ends." They stayed there until the generator's fuel ran out and daylight thinned into dusk. The silence that followed was different, heavy but natural, the way forests sound when they decide to rest. Reeves packed the recorder into its case, then did something she hadn't done in years. She deleted every file, wiped every backup, and tossed the drive into the lake. The water swallowed it without a ripple. Hale watched her from the porch, his expression unreadable. "You think that's enough?" he asked. "Nothing's ever enough," she said. "But it's the closest we get." She turned to him, the faintest smile breaking through exhaustion. "You hear that?" He listened. Nothing. The kind of silence that finally feels honest. They left Raven Hollow at dawn, two figures dissolving into fog. Behind them, the cabin stood still. No hum, no vibration, just the quiet breathing of wood adjusting to weather. Months later, when a bureau technician archived the final seismic report from the region, he noticed one anomaly: 3 tiny pulses recorded deep beneath the lake bed, repeating for exactly 9 seconds before fading forever. The file name auto-generated by the system read simply, "Listener, Final Wave." No one opened it. There was no need. The investigation was over, and the sound that had haunted so many lives had finally learned to rest inside the only place it had ever wanted to live, the minds that had heard it. Somewhere, silence held its breath, waiting for the next curious ear to notice that it was never truly still. In the official record, the Raven Hollow case closes with no suspect, no active anomaly, and no further incidents. The reports are archived under routine classifications that make them invisible to anyone who isn't looking closely. No one mentions Dr. Adrian Cole by name. His credentials were rescinded, his writings sealed, his research cited in no public index. The people who lived through it, Sheriff Marcus Hale, Dr. Susan Kerr, Dana Reeves, exist now as ordinary footnotes. Their interviews, their testimony, their sleepless years, all reduced to a paragraph about auditory misperception and collective stress response. The world prefers explanations that end, even if the sound never truly does. In Raven Hollow, the Miller property has been reclaimed by grass. In summer, children cut through the lot to reach the river, unaware that the ground beneath their feet once carried a heartbeat made of copper and fear. They hear only the usual noises: the wind, insects, the faraway echo of a freight train on steel rails. No hum, no whisper. Yet sometimes when dusk settles and the air hangs too still, they stop mid-step and listen, just to be sure. It lasts less than a second, a tremor between moments, and then it's gone, leaving them unsure whether it was real. They keep walking. The town exhales. Far from there, in an anonymous archive under Quantico, one cabinet remains slightly warmer than the rest. The label has peeled, but faint letters still show through the adhesive. ECHOINCOMPLETE. Every few weeks, a sensor pings to report that everything inside is still stable. The readings always end the same way. 18.3 degrees C, pause. 18.6 degrees C, pause. 3 beats, steady. The staff mark it as normal background variation. No one checks the drawer anymore, no one needs to. And somewhere beyond that concrete, in the ordinary world of traffic and conversation and mechanical noise, the silence waits. Unchanged, unnoticed, infinite. It isn't evil, it isn't kind. It's only the space that sound leaves behind when people stop listening. That's the lesson Raven Hollow left behind. Every echo, no matter how faint, needs a listener to survive. When the listener finally falls quiet, the story ends. Or perhaps, like all stories, it keeps listening for the next person willing to hear.